The Porsche Sport Podcast, powered by Porsche Centre Leeds. Test drive the new Porsche Taycan and experience soul electrified.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The podcast will start.
The Porsche Sport Podcast, the only weekly podcast to bring you all the latest Porsche motorsport news and opinions. The Porsche Mobile One Super Cup, World Endurance Series, Le Mans 24 Hours, the IMSA WeatherTech Championship, Porsche Carrera Cup, the 24-Hour Series, SRO Championships, esports, and exclusive interviews. Make sure to subscribe on your chosen podcast platform. For more information and exclusive news, visit Porschesport.com.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Porsche Sport Podcast, because today, all the way from California, we have Magnus Walker, the Urban Outlaw and one of the most well-known Porsche collectors anywhere in the world, and a fellow Briton as well. Magnus, welcome to the programme. I have to say, I'm already very jealous of the background behind you, and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's good to be here. And there's a few Beatles behind me, so not a bad place to be. I spend a lot of time over here, so thanks for having me on.
No, not a problem at all. I mean, you're known worldwide as a Porsche fanatic, and you know there's many things within Porsche that you can get enthusiastic about, whether that be the racing or the heritage or where the cars come from or how they're made. There's lots of different touch points, but you know, Porsche's, from what I understand, has been a big passion for you for a long time. But what was the initial grab? What got your attention about Porsche and where that passion grew from?
Well, it was pretty simple. It was just the look of the car. You know, familiar story. I've told it a few times, but my love affair with Porsche started when I was 10 years old. My dad took me to the London Earls Court Motor Show. That was back in 1977. White Martini Turbo on the stand. It just looked awesome standing still. Everything that, you know, a 10-year-old kid would get excited about in a car was summed up in that one White Martini Porsche, looked fast standing still. So that was the initial hook. I had the poster on the wall, you know, whatever it is, 44 years later, I still have Porsche posters on the wall. So I'm probably more passionate about them now than I was as a 10-year-old, because I've got to experience, you know, the greatest thing about any Porsche really is the drive. So ultimately, you know, the looks hooked me, but the drives kept me engaged.
And it has, in those early times, were you, you know, as a young boy at the time, obviously motor racing was really growing and really becoming so popular in the UK. As around that would have been a year after James Hunt won the World Championship. Was Porsche's racing exploits in your attention at that time?
Probably not. You know, I mean, back then we had Barry Sheene on 2 wheels, James Hunt on 4 wheels. You know, if you're into motorsports, it was hard not to be aware of, you know, those two iconic British motorsports legends, really. I grew up working class in Sheffield. My dad had a company car. It wasn't like I was ever around Porsches. You know, in Sheffield back then in the 70s, you didn't really see Porsches. So, no, I wasn't really around Porsches at the time. My dad was keen into motorsports. So we'd occasionally go to club races at Donington, Cadwell Park, Mallory Park. So, and of course, we'd watch, you know, Grandstand on a Saturday afternoon, everything from rally into, you know, listening to Murray Walker commentate on F1 races. That was my sort of entry into motorsport racing, not specifically Porsches at that point. That sort of came later, but that was essentially my background. My dad, like I say, didn't really have any cool cars, but my uncle, who was, I guess, pretty successful as a graphic designer, he had the cool cars. And him and my dad in the late 60s had built a Lotus Type 47 in the garage that they bought in kit form from Lotus. I actually never saw that car, but my uncle David, who's still in Sheffield, he had a Ferrari Dino, so that was super exotic. He actually traded a Dino for a fiberglass 308 GTP, I guess, in 75, 76. So even though we didn't have cool cars, occasionally we'd get to kick tires on cool cars. So that's kind of the backstory there.
So
Go on, Kat.
Sorry,
Go on.
So yeah, when did you first drive a Porsche then? When did that happen?
Oh, that came way later. I mean, truth be told, I never had a driver's license in England. I was in Sheffield till I was 19 years old and then came to LA when I was 19. So I never drove in England. You could go anywhere on the bus for 10 pence, so, it was walking and on the bus. So to answer your question, the first time I ever drove a Porsche was probably one of the first Porsches that I bought that was in 1992 from the Pomona swap meet, which happened to be a red slant nose 911 conversion on a 74 chassis.
Mm-hmm.
So that was almost 30 years ago. So I've owned Porsches since 1992. So yeah, time flies. And that was, I guess, the first one that I drove. And at the time I must have been 21. And it wasn't the first car I owned, but the first car I owned was a 1977 Toyota Corolla 2TC that I bought for $200. The Porsche was the third car I ever owned. But the difference between the Toyota Corolla and the Porsche, other than the obvious things, was Porsche represented a dream come true and sort of a sense of personal achievement and what I would call the first taste of ultimate freedom. The Toyota didn't quite tick the same box. It ticked the freedom box to go anywhere where you wanted and not to have to hitch a ride and wait for people to pick you up. But the Porsche was dream come true. At that age, I was 25. So 10 years old, 1977, poster on the wall, wrote the letter to Porsche, fell in love with them. 15 years later, made my own dream come true here in LA. So that's kind of the long story from the 10-year-old boy to the first-time Porsche driver owner.
And it obviously met expectation as well. So when you first drove the Porsche, was it what you expected it to be?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's hard to say really what I expected it to be because, truth be told, I'd never actually been in one. I had the poster on the wall. I kind of lusted after one. But in Sheffield, it was sort of, for me at that time, an unobtainable dream that I didn't really think I'd ever own one. That came later. So, yeah, I mean, it was like, wow, this thing's fast, looks great, sounds good. And it was affordable. I paid $7,500 for it. So it wasn't even like it was, at the time, all the money in the world. You got to remember, back then, 20, 30 years ago, 911s were affordable cars, especially early air-cooled cars. No one really wanted those things. So, it's amazing how things have changed. But that was one of the reasons why I was able to sort of acquire so many of them was, you could literally buy them for almost next to nothing. I bought 911s for under $5,000. So, it wasn't like, and that was always the great thing about them. I talk about this all the time, compared to other exotics, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, whatever you want to say. They were never affordable like early 911s were affordable. And I'd always say, early 911s got driven, a lot of high mileage cars. You can't say that about Italian marques to a certain degree. So the Porsche really was affordable, reliable. It ticked all the boxes, it was fast, it handled, it was exciting, it looked good, smelled good, tasted good. And, it was $7,500. So tick that off the wish list.
You should be a salesperson for Porsche. I think you do quite well.
Yeah. It's one of those things, it gets in your DNA. I mean, obviously, I'm known for Porsche. I do own other cars that are not purely Porsche. I always say, true gearheads, motorheads, whatever you want to call it, it's like you just pick your poison, right? My poison, religion, whatever you want to call it, happens to be the P-car thing. But I think all like-minded individuals, you just pick whatever it is you're into, whether it's a Ford Focus or a Subaru or American muscle car, or whatever it may be. You tend to go deep dive down that slippery slope, I think, So people like to collect, whether it's guitars, cars, watches, stamps, trains, whatever it may be, right? Humans like to collect things. So I like variety. That's why I have more than one.
And when you look at the value, obviously nowadays of the older 911s and any classic Porsche for that matter, they've all kind of gone up along, probably dragged along by the 911. But in your view, Magnus, obviously you live in a part of the world where there's an amazing car culture and love of cars. Where do you think the hook point is now for the new generation coming through, the first people who've maybe had their license for 5 years or so? How do they get that same experience nowadays? How do they get involved with the Porsche world when now that the prices have just gone so crazy?
There's a Porsche for every price point. go buy a Boxster for $5,000, right? The Boxster's celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. I've often said, because people email me all the time, ask the question like you just asked me. I go, well, there's a Porsche for every price point. If you're not hooked on, got to be an air-cooled 911, a Gen 1 Boxster for $5,000, $10,000 gets you a great one, right? There's a lot of performance here. And, it's a great entry-level 911, first-time purchase 911. In reality, it's more than that. But, there's a Porsche for every price point. 924s, 944s, 928s, 968s. These are still affordable. I used to say 914s were still affordable, but that day is sort of gone a little bit. If you want a 911 and you're not hooked on got to be air-cooled, get a Gen 1 996. I'm sat right next to a 99 Aero Kit one that I bought about a year ago in the high teens. These things are still affordable. People get hooked on air-cooled, so hip, so trendy. I own a lot of air-cooled cars, but I acquired them, when they were super affordable, not when they sort of doubled and tripled and then doubled again. It's like I'm sat next to some turbos here. Believe it or not, these used to be $20,000 cars, 3-liter turbos, 75, 6, and 7. Those days have gone, but it wasn't too long ago here in America that nobody cared about 3-liter turbos. They weren't the cool car to have, even though iconic early air-cooled 911, that was the poster on the wall for me. That was the holy grail. Growing up as a kid, I didn't have a 356 poster on the wall. That was the generation before me. It was turbo, I say this all the time. I don't want to sound repetitive, but anyone growing up anywhere in the world in the 70s or 80s, chances are you had 3 posters on your wall. Porsche Turbo, Lamborghini Countach, or Ferrari 512 Boxer, or possibly Testarossa. Those were the pin-up poster hero car, wish list on the wall, right? But my long rambling answer to your story is there's a Porsche for every price point, starting probably at $5,000 and going up to whatever, $5 million. But a lot of bang for the buck with the Boxster, the 944 probably more than the 924, or Gen 1 or Gen 2 996. I mean, I don't understand why, people, it's like you can't have a conversation about a 996 without people talking about ugly headlights and IMS bearings, and I've had no issues with either of those. And, in reality, up until a certain period of time, they really kept the price point down, unless it was like a GT car, like a GT2, GT3, or even, turbo. But talk about an iconic first gen, Porsche's first water-cooled car, right? Everyone gets so hung up on got to be air-cooled, but, this is the future of Porsche that's been around now in production for 22 years by my math. So, that represents a lot of bang for the buck, a lot of usable performance as well. People tend to get carried away. They've got to have the best of the bunch, the top of the heap, the king of the hill, whatever it is. But, Gen 1 base Carrera is a lot of usable performance where you can go what I would call 7, 8, 9 tenths most of the time, as opposed to, in a GT2, GT3, there's not enough open road to go, that same ratio of 8, 9 tenths of the performance. So, you're spending a lot of money for performance that you're not getting to use a lot of the time. Whereas in a Gen 1 Boxster or a base, 996 Carrera, usable performance.
Oh, it's so true. If you think how quick these cars are getting now, some of these Porsches, modern cars, the power they've got, it's difficult to be able to use that, right? Unless you're on a track and you're able to really open it up. It's a difficult thing. What's your latest Porsche then? Is it the 996 or have you got anything beyond that point?
Well, I want to touch base on what you just said. The most recent Porsche, it's over there. I moved it around. I acquired it about a year ago this time. Is a 996 GT2, 2002 996 GT2, almost 20 years old. This was the king of the hill, the holy grail of 911s almost 20 years ago. Now, fast forward to today, you can go get a 992 Carrera 2S. So one step up above base model, manual, 2-wheel drive. Same type of performance as a 996 GT2. Almost similar horsepower.
Absolutely.
And we're talking, that was the holy grail king of the hill 20 years ago. Yeah. Now one step up above base model delivers the same performance. Absolutely. And today's king of the hill, 992 Turbo S, it's got another 200 plus horsepower on the GT2. Mm-hmm. It makes the GT2, the 996 GT2 seem slow. Mm-hmm. 200 more horsepower, 4-wheel drive, rear wheel steering. there seems to be no loss of traction, no loss of power. You know, that thing, you know, it's like you can't really floor it because you sort of go like this, you lose traction, which is fun, but you're not necessarily going fast. It's dramatic. You know, there's a lot of activity, but the 992 Turbo S, like I say, it's like how far Porsche has come in that time period is kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
You know, look how far they've come in 30 years from the 959, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
the technology. And do you like that technology in the cars? Because obviously you love classic cars, but do you like things like rear axle steer, PDK, and, you know, obviously the direction it's all going now?
yeah, I mean, there's a time and a place for everything. You got to adapt to the future, otherwise you become an obsolete dinosaur, right? Like we're having this conversation on a fancy phone. We couldn't do this on our Motorola Razr flip phone from 20 years ago, right? So you have to adapt to the environment. You know, it's like when the 911 replaced the 356 back in 1964, all the 356 guys hated the 911. And look at what an icon that's become, right? So to answer your question, I like it. I don't own it. It's what I call OPP, other people's Porsches. I mean, I've got accessibility to some world-class driving roads less than 20 miles from where I'm sat that can get you up to 7,000 feet in the hills. And there's no question that the new cars that we're talking about will get you up that hill a solid 15, 20 miles an hour faster than you can in anything that I'm sat around with way less effort. But there's also way less engagement. But then the flip side to that is if I'm commuting hypothetically from here to Santa Monica, which is 18 miles away, in rush hour traffic that could take literally an hour and a half to go less than 20 miles, you know, the manual transmission on the 996 GT2 becomes a little tedious compared to, I mean, the new thing, you know, with PDK. So it's horses for courses. I think it depends where you want to go. Like I say, the speeds on these new cars, the performance, the standard is so high that it's hard to get to grips with it in normal everyday driving situations. But the flip side to that is, you know, they sort of got the best of everything in a way, even though they're not as engaging. But it's what I call OPP, other people's Porsches, because it comes back to that, they're kind of expensive, right? You know, I'm talking about buying things that were affordable. You know, believe it or not, even my GT2 was affordable because, you know, in the 996 GT2 world, everyone wants one with no miles on it. You know, mine's got 90,000 miles on it. So the average 996 GT2 customer, not interested in it. You know, they want one with less than 20,000 miles. And I had a bunch of buddies that owned the same car with 20, 30,000 miles on it that wanted six-figure prices for it. And in reality, they drove no better than mine that I got way below the six-figure price point. I'm the third owner. The car's a lifelong LA car. It's got, you know, it's receipts this thick because whatever it needed, it got. So in a way, sometimes, and I'm a big believer in this, a car like that that's being driven and maintained actually is probably a better driving car than one that someone drives 2 days a month and keeps the mileage low. And that's one of my pet peeves. You know, there's a Porsche sort of for every person, but I'm not really too engaged with people that don't drive and that love to show me their low mileage Porsche, whatever it may be. I prefer the miles and stories and what I call memorable moments.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's sad when they're garage queens, to be honest. It's always nice to see them out being used. And you're right, they're built to be used, and they're actually very robust. And as you were saying, very reliable as well. So, yeah, I think it's almost culturally, unfortunately, a bit of a thing where it's like it has to be low mileage, but it actually doesn't. It really doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, my experience, the more you drive them, the better they are. You know, it's like when things sit, and I'm guilty of it. I do have a few cars that I don't necessarily drive all the time, but when things sit, things erode and crack and leak and, you know, seize up and things like that. So they do have to be driven. I mean, I'm not against low mileage car collections. It's kind of like you got a piece of art on the wall or a car with no miles in your garage that you like to look at. It ticks those boxes. You know, I say the Porsche world is like a nice pie, right? Or cake. There's a slice for everybody. The low mileage guy, the racer, the driver, the collector, the one that likes to hang out on golf courses and have someone, you know, judge the car with Q-tips and white gloves and tell them what's right and wrong and the wrong shade of cad plating or whatever that may be, right? You know, people like to collect paperweights on golf courses, you know, to show how great their car was restored. And that's fine for them. It's just not necessarily what floats my boat.
And Magnus, obviously, Porsche is clearly your passion, but tell us about your day job, because I think a lot of people in the public profile see you with Porsches and things like that and living the life of the collection, what have you. But what's the day-to-day job for you? What keeps you busy?
Well, I actually don't really have a day-to-day job at this moment. What got me to this point, I was a clothing designer. I had a wholesale clothing business for quite some time. That enabled me to buy this building, which is a 1902 building in LA, which for LA is pretty old, obviously not old for the UK, but I bought this building 21 years ago, and that got me accidentally into the film location business. So I rented out the building to production companies for TV shows, music videos, reality shows, everything from like America's Next Top Model to American Idol to everything in between. So those two were really the day job. The car thing for me is a hobby. It's an out of control hobby. I'm an enthusiast, but I don't restore other people's cars. This is not like an independent performance tuning shop. I don't work on other people's cars. There's no one here, other than myself and my guy that just sort of make things, tick over. So the day job really was clothing designer and I guess film location guy, where I'd rent property that I owned to production companies. And that enabled me to really have more cars than I ever thought I would own. And then, one thing leads to another. And then before you know it, you're sort of traveling around the world, attending car events and launches and things like that. And that all really came from Timur Moscovici's film Urban Outlaw that came out in 2012. That sort of told my story of everything we're talking about, growing up in Sheffield, coming to America, following your gut, your dreams. And Urban Outlaw is not necessarily a film about Porsche. It's a film about my story. And Porsche is the vehicle that takes you on my journey. And I think the relatability is everyone has a dream, whatever it may be, whether you want to be a skateboarder, a supermodel, a race car driver, a fireman, an astronaut, whatever it may be, right? Everyone has a dream, but not everyone pursues that dream to the fullest. So for me, leaving Sheffield as a 19-year-old and coming to America, that was really the catalyst, the turning point for, sort of doing my own thing, not being told, hey, cut your hair and get a real job, and following this somewhat formulated process of what happened in the 80s in England, where, you leave school, go to college, get a job. And, I was more, I guess, an entrepreneurial wanderer. And America, and especially LA, where I've been since 1986, is the perfect place to do whatever you want to do. No one's really going to tell you can't do it. And there's the opportunity to achieve those goals here, in the sense of there's so much technology and opportunity, whether it's aerospace or everything I described. You can get things done within a 50-mile radius of where I'm sat. So it's just a perfect place to sort of explore your dreams and make them come true, really. So that's kind of a bit of a background on what I do and what my jobs were or are, I suppose.
What about the racing side? So you've done a bit of competition racing as well, haven't you?
Yeah. In 2002, I joined what's called the Porsche Owners Club, amateur club, amateur racing. I went through their short track program. You do 4 time trial events, and then you work towards your club race program. So I joined in 2002, went through the program relatively quickly because, how it is. It's like a slippery slope. You get hooked, and I did all that in 277, which was a streetable track car. Drove, and I'd probably, from a period of probably 2002 to 2007-ish, 5 years, I probably did 30, 40 track day events a year. So that would be like a 2-day weekend time trial at Willow Springs, or a cup race at Laguna Seca or Thunder Hill or California Speedway, Las Vegas Motor Speedway. And probably half of those tracks I would drive 277 to the track and back. Willow Springs is a perfect example. It's, 95 miles north of where I'm at. So I could be there comfortably in an hour and a half, do the track day, drive the car back home. And, that would be the weekend. I'd drive there and back. So my car was always a streetable track car. It was never a full-blown race car. But, 5-point harness, cage, suspension lowered, sticky Hoosiers, stiffer torsion bars. And, that was where I sort of, I suppose in a way, took my aggressive street driving to the track. And I really enjoyed it for that period. But the more competitive it became, the more, in a way for me, the less fun it became, because it was still a hobby. These 2, 3, 4 day weekends, they start adding up. It became expensive. And probably around 2008, I sort of backed off doing a lot of those track days. And then all the money that I'd spent racing, I sort of sidetracked it into acquiring more cars. And then that led into building my sort of flavor of what I call sport purpose streetable track cars, which are elements from what I think of the golden era of Porsche Motorsports, the 60s and 70s. So it's like the 911R into the, 73 RSR. That was sort of my influence on the cars that I sort of adapted or modified to my own personal taste. But it sort of came through that period of doing track days and club racing.
Mm.
It's an amazing kind of lineage when you think about, you know, how California has always been a hotbed for Porsche racing, and road cars you would buy out the showroom and take straight to the racetrack. When you know, I was reading a book about James Dean recently and what he used to do with his 356, and then when he wanted to buy a 550, the dealer told him no, didn't think he was ready for it. It's but amazing in those days how you could, you know, take a road car, put a couple of stickers on it, and off you go. Whereas it's become a lot more hassle than it was before, I guess.
Well, yeah, a couple of things. You know, America's Porsche's biggest market. It has been since, you know, 1948. California, with the exception of Florida, is probably the biggest state of Porsche ownership. And the weather's great, right? So these things all add up. Then factor in, you know, movie stars, you know, James Dean and McQueen and all the others, right, that want to go racing and that have got a need for speed and want to go fast. And it's sort of the perfect environment, you know, for all of that to happen. And then after the war, you know, we spoke about it a little bit before, all the hot rod tuning shops, you know, fabricating things. And then obviously all the racetracks, you know, in that period, you know, the 50s and 60s, especially into the 60s, you know, you got Willow Springs, I talked about a bit, you know, Ford versus Ferrari, Carroll Shelby, he's testing the AC Cobra up there and the Ford GT. And so a lot of development happened in motorsports, in aerospace in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And California is just I would say it's the car culture capital of the world. And I've been fortunate enough to sort of go from here to Australia and back. So I've covered some distance. And what's great about LA, other than the diversity of Porsches, is just the diversity of car culture. Whether it's lowriders, American graffiti, muscle cars, 50s cars, you know, salt flat racers, whatever it may be, you know, there are people that are into it here and enjoying it here. So that's kind of the story there. But, you know, it's like you can go to the Porsche dealership, right? And if you're lucky, you can buy whatever the latest, greatest GT2, GT3 RS is. And, you know, there's so much performance there, like we touched on before, that it's kind of crazy how fast cars, you know, it's like 20, 30 years ago, 400 horsepower was all the horsepower in the world, right? You know, Lamborghini Countach has barely had that. You know, today that's nothing, you know, when Dodge and Mopar are selling 700 horsepower Hellcat, whatever's, right? I mean, you know, 400 horsepower is like entry level. It's just amazing how far technology has come when it comes to making power.
Absolutely. And do you like your muscle cars as well? Obviously in the States, it's a, you know, fairly big thing. Is that something you've absorbed as well?
Yeah. Back in the 90s, you know, when I was getting into Porsches at one time, this was sort of the variety I had. It wasn't purely Porsche. I had a 65 GT 350R Mustang fastback, Shelby replica with a 351 Cleveland, the Richmond 5-speed, Detroit locker. I had a 67 E-Type Jag. I had 269 Super Bs. I had a 73 Lotus Europa, and I had a Ferrari. But specifically, muscle cars, you know, they're a lot of fun. Like the Super Bs, you know, they were great in a straight line. You know, they were just a lot of fun, but they didn't really handle. But I've always liked American. You know, for me, it was a kid growing up watching American TV, Rockford Files, Starsky and Hutch, Dukes of Hazzard. You know, you fall in love with Americana at an early age, Evel Knievel, Captain America. I talk about this all the time. You know, it's funny. I've started binge watching shows from the 70s like Starsky and Hutch and the Rockford Files and Columbo. And it's, you know, it's a trip down memory lane. It's nostalgia. But the great thing about it is you see, you know, in period of these films, mostly from the 70s, all the cars that I now own. And when you see them driving around LA, it's like every car looks different. Today, every car sort of looks really similar, very generic. So, you know, the muscle car era, you know, it's made a comeback. I talk about Mopar and Hellcat, and, you know, it's for me, it's nostalgia. It's a throwback to the past, but there's also a lot of performance, a lot of bang for the buck. You look at the new Mustang, look at the new Corvette, what performance that offers for the price point, right? And, you know, to a certain degree, it's sort of hard to beat that.
Well, the Mustang's been hugely successful here in the UK, and once it's been available in right-hand drive, you see them everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, you got to respect the vet. That's what I say, because that's been in production longer than the Mustang and the 911. And then go one step sideways. Let's not forget the Mustang debuted in 1964 and a half, right? The same year the 911 came out. Those cars have been in continuous production for the past almost 60 years now, through 8 generations. You haven't really stopped. So, when you think of iconic brands and cars, you think of Ford, right? You think of the Mustang. You probably think of the Mustang and the F-150 pickup truck. But you think of the Mustang. That's what you think of when you think of Ford, or at least I do. When you think of Porsche, you think of the 911. You don't really think of a Panamera or a Taycan or a Macan or whatever it may be. That may be different 50 years down the road. But the fact that those cars are still in production, you can still go buy them. And when it comes to a Mustang and a Corvette, there's a lot of bang for the buck, a lot of performance and fun to drive, engaging drives. I'm all about engaging drives, So
Absolutely.
those two tick those bases.
Going to another extreme, then, have you driven the electric stuff like the Taycan and what?
Yeah, it's what I call high voltage rock and roll.
Okay.
I've driven the Taycan. It's certainly fast. You can't talk about the Taycan without talking about range anxiety. Range anxiety. I mean, it's how far you can go on a charge. I've got a great Taycan story. I had one about a year ago. The Porsche guy dropped it off. It had 96% of the battery charge. And he told me there's a charging station around the corner from me. I said, well, what's the range? He goes, it's about 200 miles. I go, I'm just going up to Newcombs and back. It's up Angeles Crest Highway. It's 46 miles from downtown. It's at 5,400 feet. It's this great mountain road. So it's the start of the mountain road is 18 miles from where I'm at. I get to the bottom of the mountain road and he dropped the car off. It had like 95, 96% charge. I'm not even worried about it. It's like checking your gas tank. It's full, right? And we're only going up the hill. So by the time I got to Newcombs, which was 26 miles up, I was almost at 50% of the charge. So I'd used over 40% of the charge just going 26 miles up the hill because I never touched the brakes and I was on throttle the whole time. Not regenerating any energy. Now, if I'd wished to continue to rightward another 30 miles, I would have made it there probably on, 25, 30% charge. And I know there's no charging station there, and that's less really than 70 miles from where I'm sat. Of course, when we came downhill and we're on the brakes, it regenerates charge, but there's still limitations with people worried about, and I would be the same myself, as you can't drive from here to San Francisco in a Taycan. You've got to stop somewhere and charge it up. And you can't go on your favorite twisty road the whole way because there's no charging station. So it's not like you can just dip down into a little village or town and fill it up with gasoline, right? You got to get out your app and go, where's the charging station? And hope that, it's actually working, or this, no wait. So I still think that is a little bit of an Achilles heel at this point if you want to drive long distance. They make perfect sense as, Santa Monica to LA and back, and a rip up, your favorite canyon road for a round trip of less than 100 miles. Perfect. They look good. They're fast. I'm not even bothered. I have 2 gripes with the Taycan. I will gripe about it. It really annoys me that they call it a turbo or a Turbo S, because we know there's no turbocharged technology in the Taycan. They will defend it all day long, saying, well, it just represents the top of the range. Turbo now determines top of the range, not necessarily performance, nothing to do with forced induction of an internal combustion engine. So that's one gripe. And then the artificial noise that they pipe into it, I'm like, I don't mind the lack of noise because you hear everything else, the rocks, the squeaks, the rattles, the tires, the suspension creaking. It's like, why pump some artificial sound in there, and why call it something that it's not just so you can market it? It's like every 911 now, right? 992, they're all turbos, but the cars that I were talking about are the non-turbo turbos, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the way it's all going, isn't it? Electric or turbo, really. And
I got nothing wrong. I got nothing wrong with staying boosted and turbo fever, but it's just yet again, turbo has become a word, a marketing buzzword that no longer refers to the turbocharged technology. It's just top of the line, high end, right? So kind of misleading. But my long rambling answer to the Taycan question is, I like the car. I think it looks cool. We're seeing a lot of them on the roads here in LA. It's fast and it's fun to drive with, a couple of your buddies.
Yeah.
We spoke to Patrick Long on the show with Jörg Bergmeister a few months ago, and he's got one arriving. I think he'll probably have it by now, actually, for his company car, and he's very impressed with it, isn't he, Patrick? As a factory driver, he was really looking forward to it.
I mean, the things are really fast and they handle super well, and everything that we spoke about, how technology moves forward rapidly. So. It is, like I said earlier on, it's the future. You got to adapt to the future. It's high voltage rock and roll.
And in the States, are they embracing that? Because over here, I mean, certainly there are more and more charging points, and we're certainly embracing it. I mean, I'm a massive petrol head, so it's all very strange at the moment. But is that happening in the States in the same way?
Yes and no. I think the difference is, the UK, you can fit it into California, so it's probably easier to have charging stations, more readily available. You certainly see a lot of them on the road, so the electrification is not necessarily like the big stumbling block to preventing people from owning them. I think time will tell. It's interesting with Porsche working on this clean zero emissions fuel that they're talking about. I mean, I always say, as long as you can still get oil and gasoline, I'm still going to be driving these old antiquated internal combustion things, because, I don't think they're going to go away unless gas stations stop selling gas.
Mm-hmm. I agree, to be honest. I think there's always going to be a market for it, I think. And like you say, there's still a lot of stumbling blocks with electric, and okay, that will probably evolve, but at this moment in time, for sure.
It's been the early adopter,
I mean, you talk about
You
talk about technology. Jay Leno's like the greatest car guy out there, and he's still driving around in a 1906 steam car occasionally. So talk about obsolete technology, but he's still found a way to occasionally drive a 115-year-old steam car. So. Yeah.
And technology can come and then it can go and then it can go away again. With like the motorcycle world is a big passion of mine, and there used to be a time when two-strokes was seen as just a completely dead technology, and then the East German factory MZ came along with an amazing solution to it, and then two-strokes came back and then they went away again. And I guess the first racing Porsches were hybrids, weren't they? With the what was basically a four horse-drawn carriage with little batteries on the end of it.
And look how long ago that was. It's evolution of the species, I guess. Right, you got to keep evolving, and sometimes it's like fashion. Sometimes things go around.
Comes back round. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Magnus, you've got a huge collection of cars, but every collector always has a gap. What is the gap in your collection? What's the car that's still on the list that you're looking for?
I go in phases where I really chase things hard and then I back off. I've had several goals. One was everything from 64 through 73, the early stuff. Then it was first generation turbos. Then it evolved to one of everything Porsche's ever made in the sports car. And this is the big one. This is the front engine, mid engine, rear engine, air and water cooled. So I managed to get all the what you would call Vaseke cooled, water cooled transaxle cars. So 924, 928, 944, 968. I managed to get those. So that one's done. Mid-engined, I got a couple of 914s, so that covered water-cooled. But on the list is a Cayman R or first-gen Cayman S, mid-engine water-cooled, also represents a lot of bang for the buck. Mm-hmm. And then the sort of big goal is, and this sort of fate is actually fading a little bit for me, but the big goal was one of every generation of 911. And I've talked about it in a bit of length here, getting up to the 996. Now, obviously, chronological order 997, 991, 992, 997. I don't own one. It took me a long time to own a 993. I often said they were like the Cadillac and 911s. They were my least favorite. I'm loosely sort of thinking a 997 Turbo might be my next car. I don't necessarily want to go down the road of 997 GT2, GT3 because they're expensive. 997 Turbo seems to represent a lot of variety, a lot of choice. But as for 991, 992, I don't know. And then there is a 356 on the list, but that's also, I definitely missed the 356 affordability boat. And now you have to spend a lot of money to get a 356 that actually would drive the way I want it to drive. Sometimes I joke, it's like, I might as well just go get a Beetle. But, a Pre-A bimp window coupe is something I would like. kind of a rat rod style. But truth be told, the past 2 years, I've sort of tipped my toe back into European non-Porsche cars, went down the slippery slope of a Lotus. I used to own a 73 Europa. 2 years ago, I bought a 79 S2. Recently, I acquired two E-Type Jags, one a Series 2, one a Series 3. So, there's a little bit more non-P car variety creeping into what I've got outside the door there. So, I like variety in everything. Obviously, Porsche is still the main driving force, the main passion. But you don't want to eat the same food every day.
And true, good point. Yeah, I mean, is the customization's obviously a big factor of your collection as well, which is kind of, I suppose, different to what a lot of collectors might do. Like you say, there's different ways to do it. But when you're customizing, what is it that takes precedence? Is it the aesthetics of the car, or is it the performance of the car?
Well, the car always determines to begin with whether it gets modified or not.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, I had a 64 911 slate gray numbers matching car. I would never have modified that. Mm-hmm. These turbos that I'm sat next to, 3-liter early 75, 6, and 7, other than lowering them and putting them on a slightly different wheel and tire combo, they're not getting modified. So at one time, I owned 5 67Ss, which sort of is the holy grail of an early air-cooled car. And only 2 of those cars were numbers matching cars. So I highly modified a 67S only because it wasn't a numbers matching car, and it didn't matter to me. I bought it for next to nothing with a ropey 2.2 T motor in it. So the car determines whether it gets modified. And then my modification process really is a reflection of my personality. First and foremost, usable performance. I'm not the type of guy that really overbuilds. I'm a less is more when it comes to power. I'm not a big horsepower type of guy. I'm more of a momentum type of guy. But suspension, sticky tires, good brakes, aggressive compound on brake pad, that's where I go from a performance point of view, as opposed to let's just put a big angry motor in it. So streetable, usable, what I would call, you could do a track day in it, but it's not so stiff that you're just bouncing everywhere in tram lane and you can't drive it on the street. So I think a lot of people tend to go down this shopping list of, A to Z, get all these performance parts, and then they're not really much faster than they were before they modified the car because they overbuilt it for the streetable performance end of it. It's like, you got to decide, are you building a track car or you're building a streetable track car, right? And the streetable track car really is a Canyon Cruiser, it's a Canyon hot rod that you can do track days in without it being a full-blown race car. So, roll bar, 5-point harness, proper seats, lowered, proper suspension that actually works. It doesn't bottom out, and doesn't give you a bunch of kickback on the bump steering, stuff like that. So that's what are you building it for first? And mine's always kind of the same thing, the aggressive street use. And then the cosmetic obviously is a big part of it. But what I've done, sort of what in a way is sort of become my style a little bit, is bold color combos, throwback to the 60s and 70s, the glory, the Vic Elford Monte Carlo rally into the early 70s. But perhaps the most performance-oriented car I've built to date is my 1990 964 that I built in 2015. That's just like an Outlaw slate gray. It's not this boy racer color combo. And often people overlook at it because it's not a super bright racy looking car, but that's the one with the louvered fenders, the channeled roof, a 3.8 RS spec 993 motor, KW Sport coilovers, Brembo Club Race brakes. But it's all wrapped up in this sort of somewhat subtle, or for me, subtle color combo. So for me, aesthetics is a big part of it, but it has to be drivable. You've got to be able to get in and out of driveways without, cracking your front splitter and stuff like that. And, you got to, and I'm also not worried or concerned about rock chips that you get in your favorite mountain roads and stuff like that. So that's sort of the story on modification. Probably 10 years ago, I was modifying more cars than I am now, but the 993 behind me is sort of a perfect example of a recent car that I basically just modified with a graphic package program, the 914. I don't know if you've seen that, but that was a car I took to SEMA. That was a car that was an art car that was put together in 3 days and then showed at the SEMA show in Vegas, which for those that don't know, SEMA's like the biggest aftermarket performance car convention in the States. Anyway, that one was like, SEMA's normally like big budget builds. Everyone's throwing sponsored products on the car. They're all shining, chromed out and blinged, and 50% of it's off-road stuff. Anyway, 914 was perhaps the first time a 914 had been at SEMA. Me and my buddy Felix Holst put it together in 3 days, spent about $500 and rattle canned it, and then we displayed it at Mobile One. So that was kind of like putting a very low budget art car that was built in 3 days on a $500 budget in this high tier show. So I have fun doing stuff like that.
Has there been any modification that's gone catastrophically wrong?
Not yet.
Not yet.
For me, I'm one of those guys that I visualize it, and most of the time, occasionally I'll kind of sketch it, but I don't have any graphic skills like Illustrator or Photoshop. So like the 914 was a classic one where I took a photo on this phone, printed the photo out black and white on an 11x7 sheet of paper, and got out my Sharpies and doodled it. And that car's got a checkerboard roof that when I first mocked it up, there were yellow Post-its on a black checkerboard roof. And then in the end, it just became rattle canned, and that was sort of it. The 993 behind me was just done with tape, like vinyl tape. So, I kind of see the idea in my head, and my goal really is never been to really emulate what had been done before. Like a lot of people in the Porsche world, we got to recreate this, Martini livery, this Golf livery, this Targa Florio winning whatever, or, and they'll just make it a carbon copy. For me, I'll take inspiration from that, but then I add my own flavor. It's like I pull these elements from everything I've been talking about, put them in this virtual blender, and what comes out is what you've seen. That's kind of how it is, really.
That's very cool. It makes it very bespoke as well, doesn't it? And, it's one of a kind then as well.
Yeah, and the fact for me, back to this being a hobby and not a business, what sort of separates me from a lot of the other very talented builders out there doing great cars is it's a business. And, they have to answer ultimately to a customer and manage a customer's expectations. So for me, I'm able to do whatever I want, when I want, on my own time frame, just answering to myself. And that to me is the ultimate freedom. And that's why this Porsche out of control hobby is still a hobby and not a job. People have said to me often, would you build me a car? Or why don't you do a limited run? All these people are doing limited runs, right? 5 of this, 10 of that, 25 of that. To me, then it becomes a job. Then I got to hire people. Then it sucks the fun out of it. So, I haven't gone down that road. Say again?
I totally get that, actually. I get exactly what you're saying, because you want to keep it fun and for you, don't you? And of course, you in some ways, you're obviously very creative, and you have to restrict that if it's, for somebody else, and it becomes about making money, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, these emails that I still get, can you build me a car? I love this. It's in my mind, my brain always says, well, I would then have to build you the car. The conversation would be like, I really like it, but I'd like this. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, it's no longer my car. It's their interpretation of my car is one scenario. The other scenario is people go, why don't you just do a limited run of, 10 of your 964s? That's a really unique car. But I'm just not that motivated to replicate and recreate the same thing, slightly different over and over again at this point. So that's kind of the backstory on how I modify and why it's still a hobby and why it's not a business selling cars for me. Occasionally you got to sell something to buy something else, but I got those stories too.
I bet you do.
Well, Magnus, we have for every guest we have here on the Porsche Sport podcast, we have a question which we always ask at the end. It's called the Racing Genie question, and it's basically
Does this mean this is the end of it? We're approaching the finish line?
We are indeed. Yeah,
time flies when you're having fun.
You can enjoy the Californian sunshine. So we had, in fact, we had Kevin Estra on this morning, the factory driver, and basically the question is, you can choose any race you like in any car you like with any teammate or co-driver. So he chose Henry Pescarolo in a 917 at Le Mans. So French driver, French track for him, for a Frenchman. But what would your choice be?
Oh, wow. The first thing that jumps to mind probably is Mille, only because I did it. So I guess Sterling Moss, Mille, 1955, 1956. Seems like it was a lot of fun back then for Sterling Moss and Jenks driving the Mercedes around the Mille. But that's not a Porsche answer, but that's the one that sprung to mind. So there's my answer right there.
And would it be in that car, in the SLR Mercedes, or would you choose a different car?
Probably that car. I think you'd have to, try and go back down memory lane and recreate that. Yeah, that's it. It's not like I'm going to say Derek Bell, Le Mans 917, or Richard Atwood 917, 1970, or Vic Elford Monte Carlo Rally. A lot of those would also jump to mind, but for some reason, Mille Miglia jumped to mind with Sterling Moss. So.
Well, one of my favourites was we had Larry Ten Voord, the Super Cup champion, on, and his was his own race car, the 911 Cup car at Monaco, racing against Ayrton Senna. That was his.
Wow. That's a pretty good one right there.
Yeah,
probably
it's
in the
amazing.
wet as well, right? Senna's infamous Monaco wet drive.
Yeah, bit of a challenge, that one.
Yeah,
You're gonna be
legendary drive for sure.
It was. Well, Magnus, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you and hear about all things Porsche and your life with them. It's been an extraordinary, could you call it a career? Probably not. An extraordinary hobby that's gone completely mad, as you say. And we wish you all the fun with what the collection comes next. And thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate the support. It was good hanging out with you two, and enjoy the rest of the day and pedal to the metal for 2021.
The Porsche Sport Podcast, powered by Porsche Centre Leeds. Test drive the new Porsche Taycan and experience soul electrifying.